This is the IBJ podcast for the week of Monday, April the 7th, 2025, brought to you by Taft. I'm your host, Mason King. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. In this era of online entertainment, you could switch to a streaming service this very second and watch one of the many classic movies filmed in Indiana. You would be hard-pressed to find many movies and TV shows that recently were filmed in Indiana, even those where the stories are set in Indiana. Other states, including several of our immediate neighbors, have been much more aggressive than Indiana in offering financial incentives to filmmakers, TV producers, and commercial creators. In 2022, Governor Eric Holcomb signed a law that offered state tax credits for certain elements of a production's budget. But that solution isn't the best fit for some producers who can find better deals elsewhere. And not a single project has been approved by the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, which administers the tax credit. New legislation working its way through the State House hopes to make the film and media tax credits more desirable. It would allow producers to sell the tax credits for a percentage of their value. But there are enough limitations to stymie a medium or large-scale production. IBJ's Dave Lindquist has been studying the issue and breaks down the new proposal in a story in the latest issue of IBJ. He's our guest this week on the podcast to talk about interstate competition for media projects and why an upcoming movie set in Indianapolis and featuring Al Pacino was instead shot in Louisville. He also asks current Indiana filmmakers whether they believe the new proposal would be valuable. Here's our conversation. It's my pleasure to welcome back to the podcast Dave Lindquist, who covers arts and entertainment for IBJ. Thanks for making time this afternoon.
Thanks, Mason. It is a treat to be back on this side of the microphone.
All right. Let's start back in the late 20th century. So it seemed to me that Indiana was really making a strong case for itself as a location for shooting movies. I remember when Breaking Away came out and, Mom piled everybody into the station wagon and we went to go see it because it was shot in Bloomington where she went to school. It was a big deal. In the mid-1990s, I lived downtown and the production trucks for Going All the Way, which is a super Indianapolis-centric production, were right across from my apartment, and they shot at the Red Key Tavern, which is like 5 blocks from where I grew up, Union Station, Fountain Square.
An early role for Ben Affleck.
And Nick Offerman. That was his first movie.
How about that?
And I just saw that when I was looking it up on IMDb. Yeah, but of course there are more. Tell me about what else has been shot here.
Well, of course, sports in Indiana, that union, which is celebrated, also is represented in film. Of course, Hoosiers, A League of Their Own, Rudy, 8 Men Out, Blue Chips. And I think those are cool stories because in the case of A League of Their Own and 8 Men Out, there's some historic baseball parks in Indiana that were, preserved forever in these films, which are actually good movies also, which helps.
I saw A League of Their Own at the new Victory Field, or I guess it is Victory Field.
Yeah.
It would have been the Busch Stadium before.
They had a screening at the ballpark?
At the ballpark. Yeah, everybody would sit on blankets in the ballpark and watch. Yeah.
That is cool.
So movies are notoriously difficult to shoot on location. What has happened, at least it's been my sense that what has happened in the last several decades is that TV and film production have centralized in particular cities or particular states. Like I know that Montreal, Quebec stands in for a lot of cities. I mean,
Toronto, Vancouver. So Canada has a good thing going.
Yeah. And I've seen enough end credits for TV shows to know that the Georgia Film Commission is a massive hub, or the state of Georgia is a massive hub for TV production. How is it that happened?
So lawmakers in these states hit upon the idea, I actually don't know where they got the idea from, to try to attract productions by offering a tax credit or refund, again, an incentive to come to our place and make filmed entertainment. In the case of Georgia, not only do they have a great deal for filmmakers, they also have an individual, Tyler Perry, who's, just this stuck the flag down and has made a huge industry upon himself. So I guess we could try to talk through these tax credits. I'm not an expert, but I've talked to some people who explained them to me, and I guess I'll give it a shot.
Is it fair to say Indiana has lagged many states in incentivizing film and TV production? And in doing so, encouraging an expansion of that ecosystem for technical talent and production facilities.
Yes. So back in the day when we were talking about these films in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was just generally Hollywood and everyone else. And this was also before a lot of visual effects. So you really wanted to shoot where the stuff was. But as other states have used this financing instrument, some of those things aren't as important to these filmmakers. The bottom line is the bottom line. And so my favorite example in this scenario, this world of filmmaking, is how Pittsburgh stood in for Indianapolis in the film adaptation of Indianapolis author John Green's The Fault in Our Stars. If you watch that movie, the male lead wears a Pacers jersey. There's lots of references to Indianapolis. A key scene in the book, and it's also in the film, is when the two leads visit the 100 Acres Art Park at Newfields, and there's a very distinctive sculpture. It's called Funky Bones. Now, what the filmmakers did is in Pittsburgh, they made a papier-mâché version of this sculpture, which is big. It's a big thing. And that was more efficient and affordable than just actually coming to Indianapolis and making that scene here.
That is blowing my mind. I didn't know that. I just always assumed that for that scene
Right.
that they came here. Like, what would be so difficult about just coming here and doing it?
As you kind of foreshadowed, as these productions have gone to other places, they've built an infrastructure of talent. There are crews, there are catering people, just all the things that go into making a movie. One of the producers I spoke with for my report was saying the two things that keep him up at night are, where do my people eat and where do they sleep? And that's not necessarily a glamorous part of filmmaking to, people who just watch movies, but that's a big chunk of money and attention that needs to be paid. So in these places, that's also a big part of the story and a revenue stream.
Okay. So, Indiana has talked about incentivizing filmmaking or some sort of TV or film production for a while. In 2022, we got our most recent iteration of that. What did the Indiana legislature pass in 2022?
Yes, we now have a film and media tax credit that allows a production an income tax credit of up to 30% to offset qualified expenses. So these are things like payroll taxes, local wages, equipment, location rentals, accommodations, and catering. Just for the sake of explanation, let's pretend that you and I are a film company.
Ooh.
Mason and Dave Films, LLC. And we're going to make a $10 million project in Indiana.
I'm not bringing a lot of money to the table, just FYI.
Yeah, we'll have to make some asks. So if we were to get the full 30% off, that represents $3 million.
Yeah.
And what that applies to is $3 million as it's represented on our Indiana tax liability. Now, because we've formed this LLC just to do this modest-sized picture, it's unlikely that we're going to have a tax liability of $3 million. Wow.
I have an overpowered tax credit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, regrettably, nothing's happened. This incentive has languished for the last 3 years.
Has nobody applied for it, or have the people that are in charge of granting it just said no to everybody?
There have been nearly 30 applications and 0 have been approved. What's attractive and does make this work is something called transferability. If my tax credit can be transferred, in other words, we can sell it for a percentage of its value. And that's what the new legislation that's in the General Assembly right now will do. It allows a production company to transfer its tax credit.
Okay, I think I know what this is. So we have a $300,000 tax credit. Our tax bill isn't anywhere near that. So we go to Nate Feltman, the owner of the IBJ, and say, we're going to sell you this $300,000 tax credit, and you can apply it to whatever any of your taxes that you want.
Yeah.
And we're going to sell it to you for $200,000. So you get $100,000 of value.
Yep.
We get cash.
Yep.
Which is what we want. And then we can apply it to maybe our tax bill and any other kind of expenses that we want.
We can give it back to our investors. So they're feeling like, hey, I'm already not feeling too bad about this movie that'll probably bomb.
No, you can't tell them that.
So, and this is what's worked in places like Georgia. And it's really interesting that Indiana, as sometimes happened, we're cradled by 3 states around us that are really humming in the film incentive game. Ohio, Kentucky, and Illinois.
So they do have transferable tax credits.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're trying to get in the game.
Now, what is being proposed specifically in the legislature?
All right.
To make this work?
When it was introduced as Senate Bill 306, no dollar amounts were attached at all. And it sailed through it skunked. It was like 98-0.
Whoa.
It navigated its way through the House. On the last House Ways and Means reading, a representative introduced an amendment. It's kind of a good news, bad news scenario to some people. So as the proposal stands now, it hasn't, been completely reconciled and sent to the governor yet. But
there's like 2 different versions of the bill. Like this happens to all legislation. There's a House version and a Senate version. And so now they're at the point where they need the people in charge need to go, okay, what are we really going to try to pass?
The version that made it out of the House limits the total amount of available film tax credits to $2 million through July 1st, 2031. That's not per year. That's $2 million spread across the next 5 or 6 years.
So the state's only going to grant a maximum of $2 million in tax credits for 6 years.
Yeah. And the per production cap is $250,000.
Okay. So we could have a $20 million picture. We're still only going to get $250,000 total.
For some comparison, in Kentucky, the maximum credit per project is $10 million. So that's $10 million versus $250,000. And each year, they make $75 million in tax credits available for projects. And in 2024, $68 million of that $75 million was claimed.
Wow.
So I think I used the word modest earlier in this podcast in a different context, but that would probably apply to what we're talking about in Indiana.
Okay, let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ podcast.
Taft, today's modern law firm. With more than 800 attorneys in 8 primary Midwest markets and the District of Columbia, we provide solutions to the business issues facing middle market and emerging companies alike. We do this through a highly collaborative and inclusive team approach. Taft, the modern law firm. To learn more, visit taftlaw.com.
All right, we're back with this week's edition of the IBJ podcast. In my interview with Dave Lindquist about legislation that could make the state's tax credits for film and media projects more attractive to creators. So what are filmmakers saying about what has been proposed? And I want to start with the Bloomington-based Pegasus Pictures, which is one of the most active, if not the most active filmmaker in the state. Like if you've been listening to the IBJ podcast for a few years, we did a piece with the Pegasus guys about filming an adaptation of Michael Corrida's novel, So Cold the River, in the West Baton Springs Hotel during the pandemic.
Yeah. To me, that's a dream team. Michael's book and them as filmmakers. Really, no pun intended, but Pegasus has flown in the face of the idea that you can't make movies in Indiana. Their first film was The Good Catholic, which starred the company's CEO, Jonathan Spicer, in the title role, basically. And the film also included Danny Glover. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
They've also made films called Miss White Light, The Miseducation of Bindu. The Miseducation of Bindu was kind of cool because it was made at the old Broad Ripple High School.
Oh, yeah.
site.
While it was closed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And a couple of years ago, they made this picture called The Duel, which is kind of a raunchy romp kind of thing. I don't know if it's raunchy, but it's kind of a drama comedy. It starred Dylan Sprouse. Its main setting was the Asherwood Estate in Carmel. And they also the movie was set in your mind. It was like California and Mexico, and in Indiana, they drove up to the shore of Lake Michigan, which stood in for the Pacific Ocean.
It is about that cold.
So yes, they are doing it. They continue to do it, but they've kind of grown to the point where, well, I should back up. When there was no film tax credit in Indiana, they worked with the IEDC to kind of massage the venture capital tax credit, which is transferable, and that helped them make films that weren't huge budgets.
Yeah. And that's an Indiana Economic Development Corporation.
Right. They are the administrator of essentially, I don't want to say all, but the tax credits in Indiana.
Yeah, go to ibj.com and look up IEDC. You'll find about 10,000 stories.
And if I could go down a side path here for a second, one of the reasons that only $2 million is kind of being earmarked for the proposal right now is that it's part of a pool of $250 million in tax credits the IEDC administers each year. So the IEDC might need to weigh the benefits of a film project against the value of a company expansion. So one of the good things about Pegasus is that they've graduated in a way. They're now collaborating with other production companies. Their budgets are getting larger. If I could just touch on 2 yet to be released movies with huge Indiana ties that were filmed in the past few months in Louisville, Kentucky. One's a Pegasus project. The title of the movie is called The Revisionist. Alison Brie plays a novelist who sparked controversy by bringing real people into her fictional narrative. Isn't that our fear? In addition to our film careers, Mason, when we have our novels, our great American novels, we don't want to paint people in our lives in a way that they're going to be upset with us.
Yeah, I don't want a character based on me.
That seems to be the plot of this movie. One of the actors in this movie is Dustin Hoffman.
I know him.
The Dustin Hoffman,
Yeah.
right? And the good folks at the Kentucky Entertainment Incentive have a database that shows how those $68 million were claimed in 2024. The Revisionist has a potential tax credit of $750,000. So when I was speaking with Zach Spicer, the CEO, he's very encouraging of Indiana getting in the game of tax credits.
Mm-hmm.
But realistically, even if this version of the bill was law right now, The Revisionist would not be made in Indiana. There's just not. He's like, it's not fair to our investors to say $250,000 is good enough when we could be getting $750,000.
Got it. So yeah, if they made it in under this new version of the bill, if they made The Revisionist in Indiana, their maximum tax credit is $250,000.
Yeah,
they've made it in Kentucky, and they're in line for $750,000 tax credit. So it sounds like upper hand Kentucky.
Let me throw this one at you. No, the 1977 story, the hostage incident with Tony Kuritzis and the banker Richard Hall. There's a film adaptation of that was just made in Louisville. The director is Gus Van Sant, who people know as the director of Good Will Hunting and Milk.
I love Gus Van Sant.
Yeah.
Drugstore Cowboy was maybe my favorite movie of the 90s.
Don't leave a hat on the bed.
Not by Ben Hogan's.
We should do a podcast rewatching Drugstore Cowboy.
Yeah, we should.
One of the cast members in that film is Al Pacino.
Oh, in this new one.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Dead Man's Wire, a film all about Indianapolis downtown in 1977, is going to be depicted on screen as Louisville. Louisville is going to stand in for that. But it's funny how people look at things differently, because I saw on social media, someone, I think from Louisville, was like, how pathetic is this? Louisville is so regressive that we have to be Indianapolis in 1977.
That's fair. That's fair. It's galling, though. I mean, as somebody, I was 10 years old when that happened, and I remember it very clearly, like watching it, with Howard Caldwell at the, Channel 6 News. I mean, it was just a big deal. You knew the name of Crisis was like emblazoned in your brain for the rest of your life.
So the radio person was Fred Heckman, right?
Yeah, right. WABC. Yeah.
And John Hamm, known as Don Draper, of course, and other roles, he did a podcast within the past couple of years of this story where he was Fred Heckman. And there was a local documentarian who made a documentary a few years ago, and he called his version Dead Man's Line. This movie made by Gus Van Sant is going to be called Dead Man's Wire. Mm-hmm. And for people, it's a really, the whole thing was strange. But what Crisis did was he attached a gun and some type of wire to the neck of the individual.
It was around the neck of Holm. Yeah.
And I guess the idea was, Crisis is like, well, if somebody takes me out, I automatically, this gun will go off. And thankfully nobody was.
Sounds like a Pacino picture.
Dog Day Afternoon.
It kind of does. Yeah, all I can say is that's galling. I mean, it's just such a part of, like, where you of your personal history in a place. It's like if they did like the life story of David Letterman, and they like had some high school in Toronto stand in for Broad Ripple, where I went to school, and like rebuilt Atlas Supermarket, in Quebec.
Well, that's filmmaking today. Mm-hmm. Certainly a filmmaker in Indiana who I wasn't able to speak to for this story, but who's always in the orbit of filmmaking in Indiana is Angelo Pizza, who wrote the script for Hoosiers and Rudy. And he, this past fall, made a film in Bloomington, which is essentially kind of a coming of age story. He wrote about himself. I think he's a junior high student who gets some good influence / bad influence from a friend. So that looks like a really interesting project. He's also talked about making a biopic of Carl Fisher, one of the founders of Indianapolis Motor Speedway and the founder of Miami Beach, Florida.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And Angelo has talked about, well, it's not like it used to be with visual effects and CGI. I can make 1910 Indianapolis Motor Speedway, basically out of magic. It's funny. I was looking at some clips about the making of 8 Men Out in Indianapolis, and I think they added a couple of days to the shoot because they were trying to get people to come out and be the fans at Old Busch Stadium, and they weren't really, well, come on, people, take a day off work, go see John Cusack and Charlie Sheen.
Yeah. Isn't it, maybe it was for Hoosiers, which they partially shot in Hinkle. They didn't have enough people to totally fill Hinkle.
So they do a lot of moving around.
Yeah, and they move the crowds around depending on the shot.
Yeah.
Okay, so as proposed, this tax credit, this film and media tax credit, sounds like it's geared for kind of a very specific select size kind of production. For it to make sense, I mean, you'd have to have a budget of about $1 million.
Yes. So on the bright side, a lot of documentaries are made for about that amount of money. Commercials certainly would fall under this. And it's interesting.
$1 million commercial. I guess that makes sense.
Well, under.
Yeah. Right.
Really the thrust of the idea for this time is coming out of Northeast Indiana. The Senate author is Andy Zay from Huntington. And up in Huntington, there's a school called Huntington University where they have a pretty good digital media arts department. And again, this is kind of a pandemic story. The dean at that school used to send, his students to California for internships from, 2020, 2021, 2022. He decided, well, let's just make some movies here. So they've made feature-length films called A Carpenter's Prayer, which is out. Stephen Baldwin had a role in that one. Patterns is a film that's been made and yet to be released, and they're already starting production on a film called Overhill Manor. So for Senator Zay, he really looks at this as a brain drain issue. We have these students at whether it's Huntington or Ball State University or IU who are trained and learn the film arts. And when there's not work here, they go elsewhere. They go to Georgia. They go to Vancouver. They go to Hollywood. Also from Fort Wayne is Representative Christopher Judy, who introduced that amendment with the actual dollar amounts. And Senator Zay was like, I don't know if he's trying to make lemonade out of lemons, but he's like, well, this is a good thing because now we actually have, a bucket of money that's set aside for this, at least. And optimistically, they're thinking, okay, let's get some proof of concept here. Let's get a couple of productions that maybe show that more people want to make movies in Indiana. Which brings me to Zach Spicer, again at Pegasus, who is, he told me he's wary of this happening. He's like, if this tax credit is out there for 5 years and, kind of sizzling, big-ish, eye-catching productions don't come to Indiana to use this, which is probably unlikely, knowing the dollar amounts. Legislators might say, we tried it, didn't really catch fire. I guess nobody wants to make movies in Indiana. And Zach is like, no, that is not the case. And I believe it when I hear filmmakers talk about the biodiversity of our state, again, from Lake Michigan being an ocean to, all the woodlands of the south part of Indiana to what we can portray as a city in Indianapolis. There's a lot here, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Farming, corn.
Yeah.
I mean, always an interesting place to stage a movie. What about Pegasus? So they've now made the movie in Louisville. Do they foresee doing any projects in Indiana in the future?
Zach Spicer told me when we work in Indiana in the future, it'll just be smaller projects. But meanwhile, they're getting calls from larger production companies that have seen what Pegasus can do. Pegasus has a reputation of a production company that can work lean and efficiently and turn out, good-looking films. So it's kind of bittersweet. We have a film company in Indiana that's doing well, but we might not see Indiana in their future films.
This was something that was interesting when I was looking this up. That you would think, okay, maybe films wouldn't be appropriate for this. What about TV shows? TV shows are immensely expensive to film now. I mean, like an episode of a streaming series, like a 1 hour network streaming show, I mean, it could be $5 million.
In my report, I mentioned that in 2022, the Wall Street Journal reported that each episode of Stranger Things 4, that's the retro sci-fi series set in fictional Hawkins, Indiana, although it's made in Georgia, each episode was $30 million.
You have got to be kidding me.
Right?
Where was I?
Right?
That's got to be mostly the effects team.
Well, buying the rights to Kate Bush's Running Up That Hill probably wasn't that expensive when I mean, Kate was really the winner, though. That song blew up.
What about short films? I mean, we just got done with the Oscars. I mean, short films are popular. There are festivals for them.
Yeah.
This seems like maybe $1 million would be a good fit there.
I'm glad you asked that. One of the people I talked to for the report is a guy named Greg Malone, who for decades had a commercial-focused production company called Road Pictures. In the past year, he served as the producer for a short film called The Ice Cream Man. The Ice Cream Man made the short list of the Academy Awards. I don't know how long this has been going on. I don't think a lot of people know this, but every year the Academy Awards will reveal in some categories, like these are in the running for being a nominee. And The Ice Cream Man was one of 15 films. Didn't make the 5 for the nominee, but that's pretty good. And The Ice Cream Man is a story about Nazis in Amsterdam in the early 40s. And Noah Emmerich, who played one of my favorite all-time TV characters, Stan Beeman in The Americans, portrays the Ice Cream Man. And the film was made in 2 places, Columbus, Indiana, and Amsterdam. And 2/3 of it was made in Columbus. And Greg told me that almost everybody on the crew was people with a background in making commercials in Indiana.
Right. Yeah. And that's my concern would be, although, I'm grateful that they're trying something, is that, in order to develop that critical mass of creative talent, they need to have something to do.
Right.
And if
it's a chicken and the egg.
Yeah. And if, they can go 90 minutes to the South and be involved in dozens of productions, why not move to Louisville?
Mm-hmm. That's a tough one. Yeah. But in a optimistic scenario, there will be more work, and maybe crew sizes in Indiana can grow, and there'll be more people who can do the jobs that are needed for films.
So we will know, relatively soon, whether or not this survives the final legislative steps and then goes to the governor.
Yes. What's interesting to me about this one is that it's out there on its own. To me, the weird thing about the 2022 tax credit is it just kind of showed up, folded into a piece of legislation, and I was like, oh, it happened. Because this is a long story. There have been many years where people have tried to get a tax credit. We actually did have a tax credit for a minute. And the problem with that one was it was only like 15%, where all the other states were 30%.
Mm-hmm.
So we're kind of Goldilocks in this thing, hoping we'll get the right size and the right time, and we'll see.
All right. Well, keep watching IBJ.com. We'll have the story. Thanks so much for your reporting. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
My thanks again to Dave Lindquist. And remember, you can check out his story about the tax credits on the front page of this week's IBJ. And before you get on with the rest of your week, there are a few other stories in this week's edition of IBJ I want to draw to your attention. First up, Old National Bank is working on a first-of-its-kind project, the launch of an Indianapolis-based bank whose target customers are minorities and those underserved by traditional banks. Susan Orr reports on its progress so far. Also in this week's issue, Daniel Bradley follows up on the still unrealized plans by grocery chain Hy-Vee to open stores in Zionsville and Fishers more than 3 years after they were announced. And Derek Schultz runs us through the $60.5 million overhaul of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum. Now, again, you can find these stories in the latest print edition of IBJ or online at IBJ.com. Now, it is quite a bit easier to access all of the latest business news and all of IBJ's data on Central Indiana's business community and economy if you're a subscriber. We're running a promotion right now that gives you complete access for $1 per week for 3 months. Just to get a sense of how valuable and original our content is, just go to IBJ.com and click on the subscribe button. And thanks for making time this week for the IBJ podcast. I'm Mason King. Hang in there, everybody. We'll be back again next week.